Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Today we'll be looking at the highlights of the IMF-Japan conference, tax conference, which was held recently in Japan, where you had about 21 countries in the Asian continent came together to draw policies as regards tax administration in that region. What is so peculiar about the tax system in Asia countries? That will be the thrust of our conversation. We're also going to look at some of the things that they decided on, some of the decisions that were arrived at this conference. What is so important is also the fact that they're also looking at the implication of this on other continents and how other continents can draw lessons from this tax conference. We're also going to do a kind of review on the tax system in Africa, and by extension that of Nigeria.
Joining us in the conversation this morning with B, Dr. Kemi Fowokan, who's a group head, strategic tax and compliance, Dangote Industries Ltd, and she joins us virtually this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. How are you today?
Great to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
All right, now let's get straight into the conversation. Now, this conference was for the Asian continent. The IMF wanted to take a look at the tax trend in Asian countries and see how it can improve its tax collection system. But let's take a look generally at the tax trend in Asia. What do we find when we look at that?
Okay, I think if we look at what the conference is about, it's more for the Asian countries to look at their tax policy, the challenges they are having, and then what are the best practices. Trying to do peer review of what has happened in each of the countries. What are the good things we're taking? What are the learning points we're going to improve on? And these are things that they've come together. They also looked at things around digitalization. This is something now that has come to stay. Whether you're in Nigeria, you're in Africa, you're in Asia, you're in the Europe, you have to talk about digitalization. Now there are things around international tax. Now countries are now having international tax cooperation amongst themselves to build an effective tax system. These are all the things they've looked at, and it's a matter of let all the Asian countries come together, learn from what Japan is doing. What are the trend of tax reforms? What is tax administration doing better to enhance voluntary compliance? What are the knowledge that can be shared across each other? And then how best can they go back to their respective countries and improve on what they've been doing? And I think this is a very laudable attempt to do, because if you look at it now, tax is no longer within your national borders. It is crossing so many borders, and it is now the right time for them. They are actually doing the right thing at the right time anyway, to look at how best they can get their own share of tax, especially when business are now globalized and businesses are moving beyond Asian borders. They're moving beyond Africa borders. They're moving beyond Europe borders and to different places. So this is the crux of what have made them to come together and to see how best they can go back to their various countries and do better in terms of tax policy, avoiding any policy somersault in the way they do things, avoiding any way whereby taxpayers are not seen as the king. If you look at it, you need enough these people to be voluntarily compliant to even reduce the cost of compliance. These are all the things they've come together to look at and see how best they can go to their respective countries and make it something that is practicable and will work for them.
All right, Dr. Fowokan, good to see you again. Now, let's look at some of the emerging issues from this conference. And one of them has to do with the issue of digitalization. And we're in the era of artificial intelligence. So talk to us, the trend when it comes to tax administration, talking about the introduction of digital network or platforms, and also the influence of artificial intelligence when it comes to tax administration globally.
Okay, if you look at one of the things they looked at, they're looking at how do they leverage on digital technologies to enhance tax compliance. And here in Nigeria, let me also bring it a bit home. We have also seen the impact of digitalization in the way businesses are done, and that's why we came up with significant economic presence. So they have looked at this more, and it's more prevalent in their own area than even in our own Africa setup here. So they've seen that tax administration has to change from the traditional way of getting taxpayers to file returns, to traditional way of getting taxpayers to comply with their tax obligations, to how best they can leverage on technology. And when you start talking about AI, in fact, I was telling people, I said, with the era of AI, you don't need to struggle so much to get information. The information is all out there. You can actually, based on artificial intelligence, get information anywhere you want to get it from. I know some African countries are far behind, but for the Asian countries, they are now looking at how best they can explore the opportunities in AI to be able to reduce their cost of tax administration, and also to be able to have international cooperation in terms of cross-border tax activities, and look more into that era of technology. So, and most of the areas they're looking at is also their tax policy. How would the tax policy be revamped to take advantage of the opportunities that the digital economy, the digital environment has given, the opportunities that AI can give them in seamless tax administration.
Talking about the use of AI or digital means to collect tax in Asia, most Asian countries, indirect tax actually for most part of the taxes collected. Do you think in using AI is going to make it easier for them to do more of that, or even move to more direct tax system?
Well, I think with what they are planning, and with what they are looking at, it's easier for you to collect indirect tax using AI, because this is right from the point of tracking transactions. You can actually analyze what goes on in each of these transactions. And, direct tax is more of you determining the income on which taxes will be paid. But for indirect tax, has to do with transactions, has to do with consumption. And it's easier to track transactions across different borders. And we are now in the era of big data. Once you are able to analyze data, you're able to determine what goes on within the network or the exchange of a country. And you can actually leverage on AI also. You don't even have to have a presence somewhere before you are able to collect a tax that relates to indirect tax. For instance, in Nigeria now, we are saying if you come here, you have a digital platform here, you're operating a business here, you have to, VAT will be applied on you. And you'll be surprised that the likes of CNN and the likes, all the tech companies are also complying with that. So they don't need to be here to be once consumption can be identified, so they can able to get out. So I think the AI will assist more in the indirect tax space, because direct tax still has some level of presence which you need to determine and the likes. But for the indirect taxes, it's transaction based. And as long as you can track the transaction across networks, across digital platform, then it's easy to track and make sure that collection is enforced.
We also understand that for Asian countries, many of them, with the exception of Japan and Korea, they also have a large informal sector, and the indirect taxes too also come from this area. Would that angle present a challenge?
Well, it depends on the system that is put in place. And I know that attempts, if for some of these countries, you can't even go and do anything with the indirect, with the informal sector. They are registered. That's the way they've been able to even capture them, getting them to be registered. And when you're having transactions across, even when you're using the POS, you are able to, they can identify who you are paying what to and who is collecting what. And so they can easily track what has passed through that system. So I think with the indirect tax population that they have, they will still be able to meet up with their target of getting these revenues in. And bringing them into the tax net will even make it easier for them, such that they won't be able to escape any transaction that has gone into that area. And not only in Asia, in most other countries, we have majority of the population across the indirect tax, indirect informal sector. A lot of people, a lot of taxpayers fall in the indirect informal sector. And once you can actually harness this population of taxpayers, you are able to even meet the tax revenue target, because they are the point of contact for most taxpayers.
All right, most Asian countries, they are battling with the issue of aging population. I would like you to talk to us. What might likely be the impact of these on the tax system in those countries?
Okay, when you talk of aging population, you actually know that means the workforce is on the reduction side, and what that means is that when you talk about, let's look at directors, for instance. Directors comes from your being able, your productive capacity and being able to generate income on which tax will be paid. And then when you talk of consumption, who are those that consume more? Even when people get to an age, a particular age, their level of consumption is the level of the type of food consumption pattern that they have will change, rather than comparing to the younger generation that we have out there. So this is going to have an impact on their revenue generation, and that's why they are also looking at their tax policies. How best can they? What do they need to adjust? What do they need to amend? Because these things start from the policy level. Your policy needs to look at what is your economic realities and then be able to address that. So what they'll be looking at as time goes on is how best to see how they can get that productive capacity to be enhanced, such that they can still have a steady flow of income into their different economies. And as the aging goes, there's a revamping. I know sometimes in the UK they had to address things like this by encouraging people to come for the we have this special immigration status that was given, so they can have quite a number of younger generation coming into their country. And I know that what I expect the Asian countries to also look at is how best they can have a good mix of this demography in terms of the working level and the aging, such that as the aging class are increasing, they can also still have a steady income by bringing in those that have that high productive capacity.
One challenge with many Asian countries is having a low tax to GDP ratio when compared to other countries of the world, particularly countries that are developed economies. The only countries that have been able to achieve, according to the OECD global average, is Japan and Korea. Japan were able to grow theirs from 25% to about 34.1%. What do you think is part of the issues why many Asian countries are able to have increased tax to GDP ratio?
One of the things that has helped them, it's you can't just get out of you can't evade tax like we have in some other countries. Like I said, their level of technology advancement is not in doubt, because they are able to actually track their taxpayers, their data, the level of the data on the population, the level of data on the citizens, the level of the data on their businesses is also what has been an advantage for them. And if you look at even the consumption pattern of other countries that even also have business dealings with them, they are able to also see the quality of their outputs that is making more influx into their environment. So I would say that they have a hold on their population, and they are able to look into their policies to see what are the economic needs of their country, and then work out tax policies towards achieving those economic needs of the country, and also ensuring that taxpayers are encouraged to contribute as much as they can to that. And that's why they would be able to increase their tax to GDP, because of the voluntary compliance, which is one of the things they also want to enhance by virtue of this conference. How best can they encourage voluntary compliance? Because that's also a key to having that high tax to GDP. You create an enabling environment, you monitor what businesses are doing, and you also monitor, give them that opportunity for voluntary compliance so that they can actually contribute to the economic development of the nation.
Now, earlier we talked about the adoption of digital platforms and artificial intelligence to tax administration. Let's come to Africa now. I would like you to give us a picture of how Africa is catching up with the adoption of AI or technology to its tax administration. What are the challenges and what are the ways to resolve them?
Sorry, for Africa is actually behind schedule when it comes to some of these things. But I would say we are moving. Why did I say that? We had this 2013 when we started talking about transfer pricing. We started from that platform. And why do we have to even look at that? There's a particular aspect of which is the digital economy, which is a major area that has made the life of Africa to change when it comes to tax management. And the era of the base erosion and profit shifting, which are the 15 actions of OECD, and that moved into we looking at digital economy, has made most African countries to start looking into the digitalization of businesses and the globalization that across all businesses. I would say that Africa is already taking the bull by the horn, is making a move in the right direction. If you look at the recent OECD inclusive framework, pillar 1, pillar 2, it's also a move towards addressing the digital economy, because you don't need to have a physical presence, because you do business anywhere you want to. You can stay in Nigeria and you're operating in other countries. You can stay in the US and you're operating in Nigeria. So I think from African point of view, we are actually moving towards getting there. But there will always be a difference between the developing economy and the developed economy. We would not always be at the same pace. But I would say that as it is now, Africa is not doing bad with the way we've moved. And I think if you look at the League of Nations, South Africa so far has even signed into the inclusive framework for implementation. And that shows that we are not lagging behind. I know Nigeria is an active player when it comes to the OECD inclusive framework, though we still don't agree on some things. But I believe that with the step we've made, we are also getting a fair share of it. So I think Africa is taking the bull by the horn and trying to meet up with the challenge. Because if we stay where we are, we would be the one to lose out. So it's better we start to, even if we have to start crawling now, one day we'll start to walk and run and get to where we ought to be. So I think Africa is taking the right step. We're leveraging on technology. Our tax administration now is moving from the traditional way of filing returns. You can sit in the comfort of your home. You can be anywhere and you register for tax in Nigeria. So I can tell you that Africa is not lagging behind. And not only Nigeria, we have Tanzania coming on board. We have Zambia that is also coming on board. We have Kenya, and we have even Ghana. We have so many other countries that are leveraging on this. Though they may not be fully in the inclusive framework, but they're actually leveraging on the use of technology for tax administration. And this is a good development that we are seeing in Africa.
Talking about the pillar 2 of the OECD, which is the global minimum tax rate of 15% for multinational companies. In terms of implementation, how well is Africa done?
I would say that Africa, there's still mixed feelings about how will it benefit us. But I know that some African countries pulled out of this. But for me, I think it will be, we are not as fast as we would have thought we would be. But I would say that Africa is coming behind. If we're not careful, we may not get the full benefits if we decide to just sit and look. So the best is for us to see what can be done to incorporate and accommodate Africa in this. I know South Africa is ahead of most of us. I know Nigeria is still looking at some areas where we need to be sure we're not wiped out. We've gone ahead with our significant economic presence, which is allowed to stay. So we would not be losing out on that. But it's not been classified as the digital services tax. So that may not affect, so we can still get our own. But I think Africa is still behind. We could be better. We could improve in the way we have it. But we need to look at it very well and be sure that our delay does not mean we'll be losing out on what we could have gotten the benefit. So I think we're not doing bad, but we are looking carefully. Let me use that word. We are looking carefully at what this means to us, because we cannot just jump into anything. At the end of the day, we see that what we expect is not coming to us.
Now, there's a part of this pillar 2 which says that where a subsidiary of a parent company cannot make up the 15%, now the parent company must top up to bring up to a sum, the 15%. Looking at Africa, you have lots of subsidiaries of multinational companies, with the parent companies cited overseas or in other developed countries. Do you see the possibility of this enforcement?
That's one of the areas that I want to believe that the discussions that are going on will address, because it's easier for us to have that rule, but the implementation may be a challenge. But I believe that if you are an African country, you've signed into that framework, that pillar 2, and there's need for that top up, I expect that the other country, the parent company in the other country will have to obey the rule, because it's an agreement that has been signed. But the chances that Africa will get 100% cooperation is what most African countries are still looking at. Are we going to get that cooperation such that that top up will now come? Because we seem to have lower tax rates compared to some other places, and we have some that have higher tax rate than the 15. But now we also give reliefs in some of the in some African countries like Nigeria now, where you now have 0% people that operate in the free trade zone. That means they won't pay anything. So what happens? Are we now going to have to be the one to take that hit, or those parent companies will now have to pay us that top up to make up the 15%? These are areas which I believe that whatever agreement is going to be signed will have to be framed up. And I want to expect that once the agreement is signed, and whichever country that signed in, the countries that are parties will respect the agreement and make that top up. Now, it now means that the African countries now have to work on their tax collection, tax administration, and also work on their international tax cooperation. Because if you have good international tax exchange, you can easily be able to track what it is. If we don't have good data, we don't have good admin system, we may not be able to even track that we are losing out in this top up tax for collection by the different African countries. So we have a lot that we need to do to be able to meet up.
There's something so peculiar about Africa, which is bringing the informal sector to the tax net. Now, if we look at the reference, or we make reference to the example done by most of these Asian countries, they've recorded some success when it comes to bringing informal sector into the tax net. What kind of template can also be adopted, or what will be the lessons for African nations looking at the example or the success being recorded by most of these Asian countries when it comes to bringing the informal sector to the tax net?
Okay, in terms of the informal sector in Nigeria, we know that we have over 60% of our taxpayers in that space. And also for our tax administration process, informal sector happen to be under the state's internal revenue service. I know that for Nigeria, for instance, we are doing a lot. We now have the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy Reform, and they've been looking at the different aspects. And I know one of the proposals they are making is to have an internal revenue service, which is the national one, that will have other states as the departments under them. And this is to have like a one-stop shop for everybody. But for the informal sector, number one is that we have to see how do we ensure inclusivity in what we do. Because this informal sector needs to understand what is in it for them. Most of them do not even have an understanding of when you start talking about tax. They look at it as, oh, wow, what am I paying for? What am I paying this for? But when we can first start from governance that can be demonstrated, then we can say, look, when you pay your tax, these are the benefits that government is going to put on the table for you, and use that to see how best you can have them in. The first, it's always also good to have a data. The question that we always ask ourselves is, okay, fine, they are under the state internal revenue services. Do we have a complete data of all informal sector participants? I would say no, because they are in different forms. We may have data of some, but because this informal sector also have like, let me put it like organization or bodies, associations that they belong to. This would have been a best way of having a data of them. Now we take the major markets that we have, major areas that we have. Let's not even go to those ones that are formalized. No, some are formalized. They want, when I say formalized, they have some form of structure. How formal, we go to the markets, are we able to know how many of them? The level of education is also an issue. So taxpayer education is an issue for us, which we need to see how we can address. Then how best can we even bring them in, have a complete data before we now start talking of tracking them? Because for you to even track what goes on, for instance, you just go to a POS terminal and you say, we want to track how you do your transactions. They will not understand what you're saying. You must first of all educate them to let them know and demonstrate to them the benefits in it. So we first of all need to put all this informal sector together. How best can we put it through their different associations, have them together, have a data of what they do, to be able to track even the transactions that they do across the economic setup of the country. This is a very, very a base that we have to start from before we can even start talking about getting tax revenue from informal sector. And unless we are able to do this successfully, we may not be able to achieve this objective we want to achieve. And I know that in most of these countries, Asian countries we talk about, you can, all of them, one way or the other, are through the system. They have a track of what happens in this informal sector. So if we are able to do this, we bring them into the tax net, and through the association, through government demonstrating transparency, government demonstrating accountability to them, and let them see what their money, the little money they are paying, the taxes they are paying, can do to the economy. By that, they are encouraged to want to come in, and through their different bodies, they can now be able to have a comprehensive data of them in the taxable situation, and then how their income be taxed. Then the presumptive tax regime is also something that can be used to be able to capture them and to make sure that the government is getting its own fair share of tax from this informal sector. It's actually a serious work that needs to be done, and we are now in the era of technology. We'll see how best can we bring them in. Virtually everybody uses POS now in most of these markets. Now, how do we address bringing them into the tax net using this platform that they have? They use POS now. We are cashless. You can't pay cash. People say, don't worry, do transfer. Some will say, no, I'll use POS. So these are means of bringing them in. And I think when government is able to harness all this data, then we can have them in the net. Thank you.
Another emerging tax issue that was discussed at the conference is carbon pricing. As of now, just a handful of Asian countries have adopted the carbon pricing mechanism or carbon pricing template. And you have very industrialized nations in Asia. Take, for instance, India has a policy, Make in India. That means lots of industrial activities are ongoing. Now, one of the challenges that was identified with Asian countries implementing a good carbon pricing mechanism is accurate data and monitoring of even the emissions. How can they overcome this?
The trend of sustainability now that goes on everywhere, there is a requirement for reporting your carbon emission and things like that, especially for most of the big companies. And the only way they can look at that is from the point of having some regulations around the carbon emission, such that it's being tracked. If you look at, for instance, now taking some areas where there's reporting of your sustainability, which includes your carbon emission, then definitely you have to provide data to track whatever you're doing in this regard and report it. And by the time people start looking at sustainable businesses, these are part of what is being considered. So there might be need for some regulations that would require the reporting of the carbon emission rate of these industrialized industries, and also for that to also be tracked in terms of what is the level of damage this is doing, or level of input this is making into the environment. And by so doing, government can have policies around that. And like I said before, most of the tax reforms that they look at, they also look at the economic priorities. So if now that carbon emission is becoming an economic priority, then there need to be some regulation around carbon emission, reporting of this, and so that companies can be made to be socially responsible, and they can also be made to consider their sustainability impact on the environment in terms of their level of carbon emission, which has to be within a threshold. There would have been set a threshold within which this can be allowable. And if possible, every company would have to be measured according to their compliance with that regulation.
All right. Apart from organizing high-level conferences, just like the one we're talking about, what do you think should also be other roles that IMF should play when it comes to helping nations to facilitate tax reforms?
I think IMF should also provide some advisory role. When I say advisory in terms of tax policy initiatives for countries, because one thing is, I know the conference is part of the advisory, but IMF do have they have information over what the countries do in their different regulations, and they would be able to assess what is a trend of how these policies are going, how are the life of the citizens impacted by this. I know IMF also needs to look for a way of encouraging countries to look into the taxpayers how do I put that, how the taxpayers will fare, so that they can be willing to voluntarily comply. When there's voluntary compliance, the cost of compliance is minimal for both the government and even the taxpayers. And this is not just to have this conference, it's also to say, look, for each country, we have a data of your performance in terms of tax policy, in terms of the tax compliance, in terms of the cost of even doing business in the country needs to be also looked at, in terms of the effectiveness of your tax policies. And with this, IMF can actually come up with some advisory on how countries can do better. But they need to also balance it, because if you are looking at, you can't compare the developed and the developing. So whatever IMF is doing should be balanced. We should look at Africa, our own Africa peculiarities. But we have always had this saying that we in Africa understands our peculiarity, so the Asians understand their peculiarity, and they would be able to address their issues based on their peculiarity. So it would be good for IMF not to only look at these parameters, to also look at our peculiarity and understand us and be able to help us to be able to take us to where we ought to be. And so that in terms of our tax GDP, then it'll be good. Then they need to also advise government in terms of governance. You know, government spending is also an area where there needs to be a check and balance. When you do all this tax collection, increase tax revenue, but the spending is taking out, eroding everything, and the economy is not developing, so there will be a problem. So IMF should not just be in terms of organizing conferences for exchange of ideas, for peer review, but also to play an advisory role for both the developed and the developing, as much as possible, looking at the peculiarities of each of these continents. Thank you.
Still on the area of playing an advisory role by the IMF. Now, this conference was particular to Asian continent. If a conference like this is to be held for the African continent, what are the areas you would want the IMF to look at and help Africa with in terms of tax collection?
Okay, if we were to look at this for Africa, the first is to look at our tax laws. And I think, why did I say tax laws? A lot has happened in the business world. So we need to look at most of our tax laws. And I know Nigeria is trying to look at that now. We look at our tax laws and see how best can we deal with the challenges of digital economy, because that would be a major challenge for us in terms of tax collection. So it should be an avenue whereby we can look at our tax laws and how best we can make it to be more compliant with the trend of things in this age and time. Then we should be looking at things around modernization of our tax administration. That because data analytics, like we talk about AI and all these things, it comes with data. So they should be looking at how can we modernize our tax administration such that we can enhance our automation, our process automation, so that we can be able to use data, collect data, retain data, analyze data, and use it to identify how we can give taxpayers better services so that they can be voluntarily compliant. Then areas around tax transparency and information exchange is also an area where I believe they should be talking to us about, so that we can also be able to curb illicit financial flows that are crossing across Africa borders. Then things around taxpayer education programs, they can support, because we have different classes of taxpayer education programs, and also in designing of our tax policies to meet up with the demands of the day, to meet up with the demands of this time, and be able to take the best advantage of what we have in the digitalized environment. And all this is towards having a good economic development, a good economic growth for the African nations. Now, there are also things around our multiple different tiers of government. We have federal, we have state, we have local. How best can we harness the opportunities and the potentials in these three tiers of government such that there are no double layers? For instance, we have multiple taxation issues that businesses are complaining about, and this is making people to want to look for how best to help themselves. So these are areas that we believe that when this is looked into and tax policies are formed around making life easier for the business environment, the voluntary compliance will be there, and then we can actually talk about tax revenue generation at minimal cost.
Now, one of the emerging issues from this conference is also the taxation of high-income individuals. Talk to us. What are the challenges peculiar to getting tax from high-income individuals, and how do we resolve this kind of setback?
Now, when it comes to high-income individuals, these are a set of people that have investments across different jurisdictions. And tracking this investment requires their reporting. Now, the first area that we need to see is how best can governments across different countries explore exchange of information to track the income that is flowing in different locations for these high income individuals. Because if you don't have a good data of what their income are and where they are spread to, then you may not get, each country may not get its own fair share of tax. So it's necessary to have information. I know that Nigeria some time ago tried to come up with what we call voluntary asset and income declaration, such that say, okay, come yourself, come and confess your sins, and we forgive you. But did that actually reduce this issue? Not really. Some came, not everybody came, but we still have it. After that, we have the voluntary asset regularization scheme. Now, if there's good international exchange of information, which the CRS, competent common reporting standard, is trying to address, and the automatic exchange of information is trying to address, then it's easier to track where the income of these individuals are spread. And you know, we still have tax havens, and most of this income are likely to be tracked in tax havens, and that's why the OECD is even trying to ensure that any tax haven where people stock income because they want to avoid payment of tax will be blacklisted, and that has made things to start changing, that people are now having reporting. So for the high income individual, there's no way they can be tracked if there's no international cooperation among countries whereby there can be reporting, exchange of information. And with the exchange of information, we can track where this income are sitting and to know whether they've been taxed or not. And also have some policies which are more like international tax policies around ensuring that this income are not exempted from tax in all jurisdictions. At least they must pay some fair share of tax commensurate to the type of income. We have some that are passive income. We have some that are active income. So defining on which type of income they are, then the policies should be able to address those income and ensure that the countries where this income are earned or generated from also have some fair share of the tax that is due to those countries, and that we can be able to track and curb part of this. Then there are some part of the illicit fund flow that goes on, and this is where we have to leverage on the current exchange of information rule that we already have. How best are countries using this? This is also something that needs to be assessed. Are we getting the best maximum advantage from the exchange of information that is currently going on? Companies now report, especially global companies, they report their income all through the different places where they are. Financial institutions now have some reporting responsibilities. How best are this information being used? Are we tracking the information that come? Are taxes being paid in those countries where they are? And where the income are earned, are they getting the fair share of tax of this income that are owned by the high income and individuals?
Still on taxing the wealthy. Now, the Presidential Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms Committee made recommendations. Now, one of them was for a tax exemption of the informal sector, particularly those who earn 25 million naira and less. And then they also recommend shifting focus to 5% of the informal sector, presumably those who earn more, to the middle class and then to the elite. What's your take on this recommendation?
I think I will support that recommendation because, when those who are below grows, they will definitely fall into that 5%. If you're looking at it, it's allow them to grow. They need that exemption to be able to grow and also invest whatever they're able to make into the business and back, because these are the majority part of our taxpayers. And if you can able to bring them in and they grow, they'll be able to move on. Now, if you look at the way things are, our tax system is progressive. The higher your income, the higher your tax. But the question you also have to ask ourselves is, though it's progressive, do we get that commensurate level of tax from the high income earners? I think it is still not, we're not yet there. So if we shift more to them, looking at the Pareto principle of 80-20 rule, you're able to get more from that set of people, and that you're able to meet your target for revenue collection, while you allow this other that are the base to grow, to contribute to the economy and employ. Because even if you look at employment, they employ quite a number of people in the informal sector, apart from the industries. So it's more of an encouragement to see how best we can make them grow. And even if you say fine, they are exempted for it, doesn't mean that they will not be a data. They will still be registered, but they may not be paying the taxes, so they can actually be able to meet the basic. And most of the things that we use as basic things come from this level, so it will also be able to bring down the cost of living in the country, such that everybody can normalize. But I believe that as this informal sector below the 25 million threshold grows, then they will start falling into the category of the 5%. And the more they grow, the more you are able to get revenue from them. I guess it's just to allow them to grow. And I want to take it that our president one time said, let the poor breathe. So maybe it's part of the let the poor breathe principle, which is what we're trying to make to be realistic. Thank you.
Let the poor breathe. What a way to wrap up this conversation. We must thank you, Dr. Kemi Fowokan, for your time and your thoughts on the issue of taxation, not just in the Asian continent, but also by extension to Africa and Nigeria. Thank you so much for creating time for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day ahead.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.